15th session of Mind Next, which is set up through what we call the Mind Mondays. We've attempted to address issues of concerns to India, Indians, India's economy, and India's global relations. We've had a series of outstanding leaders come and address these sessions between 50 to 60 minutes every Monday. We are at a very strange, unusual, but an interesting situation in India right now. On the one hand, the coronavirus pandemic has hammered economies around the world. At the same time, it has created unique opportunities. And as is often said, no crisis should be let go waste. We need to figure out a way to get the best out of this. And to address some of the questions that we have a wonderful panel today. My co-moderator is Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog. I have a wonderful and a decades-old relationship with Rajiv. Rajiv, you worked in Manila in the industry ministry at ADB, with ICRIER, with FICCI, with CII. You had a very interesting expanse that you've covered in your experience. And now, of course, you play a unique role in India's think tank, the NITI Aayog, leading not just thinking, but how to action the thinking. I think it'll be interesting for us, while you ask the questions of the panelists, it'll be interesting if we can also get to ask you one or two questions. We also have Gautam Kumra, the managing partner of McKinsey and Company in India. Gautam has been in this team, I think, since the beginning. Gautam, so you are one of the 3 people who started this office, I believe.
That's pretty much, yes.
I remember having you with us in Ludhiana, as we were just discussing, in the early 90s when you had just started off. So it's been a wonderful journey that you've had, and McKinsey has been a pretty impactful advisor both in India and globally. And you also sit on the Global Shareholders Council, which is, I believe, the premier decision-making body of McKinsey. So thank you very much for joining in. And our second panelist is Piyush Singh, Senior Managing Director of Financial Services for Accenture, who heads up the office here in India, and also the financial services in Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. So thank you all for joining this session. Rajiv, let me start with you. You've worked in many places, and I'm talking now about the national level of policy making. What do you find different in Southeast Asia and the Far East, and how decision making takes place in India at the policy level?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Sunil, for giving me this opportunity, and no thanks to ask for asking a tough question. But let me say that the region that you've covered is very different.
Yes.
Because in the sense that there is a whole set of what we call Confucian societies, which are the East Asias, where authority is accepted and authority is not questioned, and authority, in fact, is quite often appreciated. And there are expectations of the authority to take decisions which are expected to be for the benefit and welfare of the people at large. And I would cover China, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan in those societies, and Hong Kong gets covered automatically, and I think also Singapore to a certain extent, where therefore there is no sort of and in fact there is no dissonance, there is no questioning of the decisions taken, and people accept this, and therefore the social contract between the people and the authority is of very particular nature, where if you want to give feedback, you give it very much in private, or you give it in analogies and in sort of, and that's it. In fact, this particular model was propagated not only by the former big man of Singapore, whose name will come to me very soon, but also by the
Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew, but also the chief economist of the World Bank, a Chinese gentleman, again, Justin Lim, I think maybe his name, as to say that the kind of model where they said that too much democracy is not a good thing for developing economies and for economies in transition. So, that's the sort of model. So their decision making is rather different. These are also very homogeneous societies, where again, I mean, that's a very big difference between what we have in South Asia. And therefore, decision making there is left to, in some sense, a democratically elected leadership, but the democracy which is not, in some sense, based on, sort of individual plebiscite, but different forms of democracy. And then once the leadership is elected, its word is writ. I mean, it's the law, and that's so. Therefore, decision making is much less, if you like, much more efficient. Could be the ideal for could be the sort of wish for every policymaker in this part of the world. But that's one. The other part that you mentioned is Southeast Asia, which is different. And I've lived in a country like the Philippines for 9 years, and I know, therefore, that there is a very different form. And in the Philippines, the joke used to be sometimes that you could overthrow a president through SMS, but you couldn't get policy implemented. And there were deep divisions within the Philippines, and similarly, I would think for other countries. I don't want to mention any one of them by name now, but there the decision making is different and relies a lot more on the sort of thing that we are used to, which is to get a populist backing of your decision making, if you like. Now in India, I think we are. I never used to believe this, but we are actually sui generis. We are, in the sense that, and I say this simply because, we are not really a nation in that respect. We are a continent comprising of multiple nations. I mean, each state, which is bigger than many countries in the world, has its own nationhood, defined by civilization, literature, tradition, culture, religion, etc. And so here, decision making is a process of coalition building. Here, the decision making is that of trying to bring as many people on board, because there is no one particular group, or a small or large group, which can hold a kind of an autarkic, hegemonic position vis-a-vis the others. So any decision that you may take can be challenged by other groups, which, if they come in coalition against a particular decision, can throw back the decision quite quickly. So here, there is a process. Decision making through coalition and consensus building is the kind of thing that we have in our country. And this is, by the way, in my 3 years now, I find is true both within the government and outside the government through the political process.
Yeah,
so
and it is somewhat unique to India, as you said, yes.
It is unique to India. It is therefore time consuming, but it's the only way to do decision making in our country, because as I said, we are too heterogeneous a country. And the famous dictum by Joan Robinson, who said that everything that you say about India, the opposite is also true. Given that situation, pan-India, and let me just make this last point, there are very few decisions or policies which have a relevant impact on a pan-India basis. I think policy here has to be far more nuanced, far more differentiated, and therefore much more, sort of in some sense, discussed at different levels if it wants to be taken forward. So therefore, those are the differences that I see in policy making.
Good, thank you. That's very very thoughtful, actually. Thank you. Gautam,
if you put a corporate policy lens on this, again, you'll find the same heterogeneous corporate strategy behavior that spans that region as well. So for example, obviously, I mean, when you look at corporate strategy, the Japanese are clearly the masters at having a much better long-term, taking a long-term view. In fact, I was at a discussion with one of my Japanese clients sitting in Australia, where they were acquiring confidentiality, I shall not say what, but acquiring another company there. And the company being acquired, which was Australian, their management said, well, we would like to hear your corporate strategy, from you. And the guy said, well, do you want the 6-year version or the 60-year version? Mm-hmm. Of the Anglo-Saxon Australian guy was expecting the 6-month version or the 12-month version. So again, the sort of span that you see all the way going from, from Japan, which is a very long-term view. I mean, that's the only place where my teams can predict. Look, Piyush-san, in 18 months' time, this person will be the chief exec. Like, okay, mate, I can't predict that for 18 days later for some of the economies, and you can predict 18 months later, the next succession. So I like that. Obviously, China is quite a bit more like our public sector, where the conveyor belt model of retirement and on a tenure happens. As Rajiv was saying, when you go to Southeast Asia, then the diversity becomes even greater. But one sense that a respect for authority in corporate structures is much greater in Southeast Asia than I find in the individual, rather than the collective body, which is the top management team, is much greater in Southeast Asia than I find in Japan, for example.
Okay. Gautam, you've been here since the early 90s. India has gone through this massive transformation starting literally around that time. How different is India today from your perspective, from what it was when you actually joined the McKinsey office here?
Wow, that's a...
It's a big question. Try and take a shot at a very short answer to this.
No, I think, look, there's so many dimensions to this country. I think obviously my vantage point is more from the standpoint of serving clients largely, and what I've seen change there. I think I'd say 2-3 things that I'd say. I think one is, for many of us who've seen here, we've seen the benefits of, I think, also the early stage of liberalization. I think we're all sitting here. And I think one of the visible benefits to me has been actually just the emergence of a whole range of companies that I think have what it takes to even compete on the global stage. Right? I don't think that was quite the case in the 90s. I wouldn't be able to mention too many at that time, but I think that whole era of liberalization that started in 91, 92 did give birth. I think it did give, obviously there was a lot of, as we all know, abuse of capital and so on, which we are still paying the price for. But if I put that on the side, I think one of the positive has been the emergence of world-class beaters, whether it's telecom companies, airline companies, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. So that has been, I think, a real privilege to have seen some of them grow to become top 3, top 5 in the world in the sectors they compete in. So that's one big change. Second change I'd say is, I think, the choice for consumers. I think, let's be honest, I still remember vividly sitting in queues for your two-wheeler, or when my father bought the first four-wheeler Maruti 800 after we thought we had got a lottery, right? When we actually got that thing in the 6-9 months. But look at the world and where it is now. I think consumers have choice, and I think it has really shifted in many ways from a supply-constrained market to a consumer-led industry, right? So that's a second very, very fundamental shift I see. Third shift, I think, is just the global connectivity. I think in the old days we used to say, India is insulated. I think depends on how you think about it, but I think at least from flows of information and data, we are way more connected than we've ever been. Maybe less so in terms of trade and services, but in terms of flows of financial information, data, and foreign exchange, much more than we've ever been. So I would say that's a third change, I would say. And there are many things that I think still remain endemic issues. We're still dealing with them. But let me stop there.
Let me come to the theme of today, the economy going forward and industry's role in it. So Piyush, we had a session earlier on health. Actually, we've done more than one session on health, especially because of the situation right now. And one was on future of health. At Accenture, you've done some pretty interesting work in the area of healthcare. Would you tell us what you think a hospital in the future would look like, considering what's happening to connectedness, data, information, artificial intelligence, the use of virtual healthcare systems. What do you think a hospital might look like in the future, which is fully geared with all of these technologies?
Yeah, look, I think the whole healthcare value chain is getting disrupted at so many levels, right? So I will try and pick some of those, and obviously otherwise it'll be a longer answer. On one hand,
for all of us to try and keep our answers short now, because there are many questions that both Rajiv and I have to ask you guys.
So that's right. So on one hand, you've got the what you call the customer care OPD services, which I do think will increasingly become virtual. Which will lead to the better availability of specialists in the for your customer care. So on one hand, there is that. The second hand, if you are a manufacturer servicing these organizations, you're also going to highly virtualize that interaction. So that's on one hand. The second hand, if you then go to what you call hospitalized customer care, then there's a whole lot of new tech investment going in that is going to make that caring much more easier. The ability for nurses and nursing staff to be able to lift patients around, both with robotic hands and robotic back support and beds. I mean, things like that, which are one of the chronic needs of caring systems will change drastically. Then, of course, you've got the real change, right, which is the entrance of data in the area of genetics and starting to solve for diseases through genetic interventions. And that, for me, is going to be the real big difference that will come into healthcare, because that will take healthcare from anything that we are doing currently in the way of interventions that we are making to a very different kinds of interventions will happen. And obviously in between, you've also got, what you've seen about, people being able to provide surgery advice and more intrusive advice, remotely, that will happen as well. So, if you look at it, it's going to help in the area of pooling of capability, that will lead to reduction in need of less specialized medical staff, and hopefully encourage greater specialization on one hand. A drastic intervention of data into medicine for genetic intervention on the other hand, right? And in between, you've got all of this new tech that will help with patient care.
Thank you. Over to you, Rajiv. You're on mute. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up with Piyush on health, which is to say that starting off, I mean, I'm sure all of us know that the genetic map of us human beings is 97% common and 3% is different. Yeah. And then that's been mapped so far. And you talked about, gene-based medicine that's coming along. But I'm told that the gut fauna of all of us, the microbial, the system of our guts, 97% different, 3% the common. So that's, and now the latest advance in the US and other places is to try and map the gut fauna. And I know from the authority of Dr. Vijay Bhatkar, who is the founder of Param, that the supercomputing can do the same for us. This is by way of background as to how you think technology can help integrate our traditional and modern systems of medicine. The traditional system, which was based specifically on one, treating persons and not symptoms, and two, where a lot of attention was given to the mapping or the understanding of the gut fauna. I want your answer simply because I've now established a committee which is trying to integrate the two. So is there something that the technology can do for us on that?
Well, look, I mean, I think the first one I would say is it is all about data analytics, right? So deep specialism of, finding the data correlation points and starting to regress them. And today using machine learning for the machine to start becoming more intelligent on finding related related relationships, right? Because the problem you've got is
can Accenture help us build in machine learning for traditional medicine?
Of course. I mean that's the look. Building the machine learning bit, to be fair, in today's world is, relatively speaking, I would say, is the easier bit. feeding the machine with the data so that the machine can start learning and persisting with that, that's the harder bit, right? Because, if you want, we will have to be on this journey for a 2-3 year period for the machines to start giving us the real insights, because of the level of learning, because the machine must get to a level of data ingestion, before it starts to provide, learning insights. So I, absolutely believe, we're doing that for a number of industries, including life sciences, particularly, of course, because that's where it is the most meaningful, across the world. So yeah, very happy to have that discussion separately, but it definitely is an area that we should be actively considering, because what this will, in a state of nirvana, what you're talking about is, if you like, is going to custom medication. Because right now we are, as you said, the modern medication is all about, can I attack the region? Broadly, if I'm, down to 60% right, and I can attack the 40%, right? Now, can I go back to saying, okay, can I be down to in the region of 3 to 4% accuracy and then manufacture a custom medication for you? So, look, that's a few years away yet, but that's where we need to be aiming to, because that's where the investment in data sciences will go.
So maybe I want to invite your attention and your teams, before I go to Gautam with my question, on trying to shift focus to what is there waiting for us to be explored in our traditional medical system, and then building the modern tools there. Gautam, for you, taking from there, we are now trying to develop in NITI Aayog a index for comparing the performance of district hospitals. Because there are 735 of them, and trying to build public-private partnerships there. The question I'm saying is a reference to say that that most of the reform action now is in the states, and this also relates to what I said earlier, that pan-India reforms now, their realm is rather limited. How do you think we can get the states to get into the reform mode, to get into much more global connectivity? And what do you think are the main challenges there?
Sure. No, thank you, Rajiv. I think, in fact, you will remember a conversation from last week where one of the things from recent work is that if you look at the reform agenda, about, we say 60% of the reform action is actually now in the hands of the states and 40% is still with the center. You see, the one thing we need to get into our DNA is the focus on productivity. If you go back what I said then, economic growth rate is a function of employment growth plus productivity growth. I think we have to get everybody, whether it's at center or states, to focus on actions that drive productivity growth, because eventually that's what drives GDP growth, that's what drives income growth, that's what drives consumption, and frankly, job creation. If you look at some of the states where we've seen high GDP growth rates, whether it's Gujarat, it was focused on manufacturing and productivity related to that. Similarly, in Orissa, it was about mining. So the one thing I would say is I think every state has to recognize that they have to be in the driving seat of driving economic growth through productivity growth, and they have to pick a handful of sectors. In fact, when we actually evaluated economic growth rate of states over the last 2 decades, what we found was that what matters much more in a state's economic growth is actually productivity growth, more than even shift in mix across different sectors, from mining to hospitals to real estate. Whatever set of sectors you're naturally either endowed with or where you have a strong starting position, we would suggest you pick a handful of them, maybe 2 or 3, and really think hard about how to put in the right enabling conditions from land, labor, power, to really drive competitiveness and productivity. So that would be the single biggest agenda from our standpoint. You mentioned district hospitals. It's the same thing, Rajiv. I think so far we've had a lot of capital-heavy models that have not succeeded as much. And I think we all know that health is also an area where you need to combine the public good, which only the government can provide, along with the private enterprise and the private entrepreneurship. And I think there needs to be a lot more experimentation on that count. But I would just...
But if I can just follow up on this a little bit. You remember, I'm sure you remember that we discussed the fact that when you talk productivity, you talk only labor productivity, output per man, output per person. And the fact clearly is that we have to, if we want to bring about a change, it will have to be total factor productivity.
Absolutely.
Which also requires a lot of capital and plus, but much more technical progress. Now, my question to you in that context is that in a country But the private sector, and this is to you, Sunil, as well, but the private sector just refuses to invest in product innovation. And that our R&D expenditure to GDP is 0.67, of which 80% or more comes from the public sector. How would you get productivity enhancement?
Yeah. So I'll just take one take at it. I think from my standpoint, when we say, you're right, absolutely right, Rajiv, when we say productivity is not efficiency. I think we're talking of productivity in a broader context of innovation, know-how, technology, IP.
Productivity is understood everywhere as total factor productivity ever since Robert Solo's time.
Correct.
Not now.
Correct.
So, but the point, so therefore, you need to think about that as well in your own work with this. Sorry to have interrupted you.
Yeah, no, I think that is the real issue for the country, right? We've seen what has happened in the last quarter as GDP has fallen off 24%. We've seen what has happened in investment rates. So even in general, as we all know, private investments have been on a secular decline for the last 5-6 years. So the challenge is very much confronting us. I think we have to find, I think the 2-3 things that I'm sensing all the time. One, I think, is really getting the cycle back on consumption. I think today, as we know, the economy is hurting badly for consumption. That's a whole agenda in itself that I think if people are also waiting for that cycle to kick in now, which was historically not the issue. I think second is, at least one thing I find is people want a lot more clarity from a policy roadmap standpoint. I think I've heard, as I've done some of the debriefs from the work last week, I saw many investors come in and say, we will come, but we need to see a clear and predictable policy environment for our sector, which can give us a sense of risk-adjusted return that we can defend and get excited about. And I think in many sectors, that has been a real issue. But you should comment, so you are in the business of investing, but I think there are clearly need to undertake some of the structural reforms to make the environment more exciting and conducive for, I think, private investors to want to jump in.
Sure. So I'll come in there, Rajiv. So first, very good question. And this is a concern. In fact, interestingly, this is becoming a little bit of a flashpoint between a conversation between government and industry right now, where government saying, why are you as industry not investing? We made all this policy headroom. We announced micro policy, fiscal announcements, and what are you guys waiting for? Industry is saying that, look, it's all very well for us to say we want to invest, but unless there is consumption and demand, where are we investing? What are we investing for? At this moment, unfortunately, because of the current situation, there is a significant amount of capacity, barring some industries. And by the way, to be fair, some industries have picked up quite well. For most others, the capacity utilization is quite low. But that more investment is required in innovation and R&D, no argument whatsoever.
Why doesn't it happen?
And smarter companies, and Rajiv, let me also go a step further. Smarter companies have begun already. It's certainly not enough as an overall economy as India, but if you see the distinction that is happening between the outstanding companies or others is mostly this. It's on the overall experience, customer experience, and in the amount of innovation and investment going into things like research and innovation and ideation in these companies. So I'm completely, by the way, with you. My view is the same, and I've argued this with industry as well.
No, Sunil,
I would
just 1 second. Sunil, just 1 second. I'm not discussing the big investment question here, and the investment cycle. No, that's not my concern. My concern is that if you want to have robust growth, it has to be based on innovation and R&D and product innovation in particular, not process innovation, because that's just reducing the cost, etc. What will it take? And I'm asking it from the government's point of view, to induce private industry in India to start investing more in R&D and innovation.
So first, Rajiv, I'm violently agreeing with you, by the way. I'm not arguing with you.
No, tell me the reasons. I mean, all three of you.
The reason is...
Okay, go on, Sunil, and I'll add something.
Go ahead, Piyush, if you want to take a shot at this first.
No, I think, first of all, if you look at today, when you look at fintech investment, fintech innovation, tech innovation, and you go to any investment hub around the world, whether it is Hong Kong, Singapore, London, New York, West Coast, most of them are Indian origin or Indian entrepreneurs.
Why doesn't it happen in India?
Yes, because and that's where I go back to Gautam's point, because there is a sense among the investors as well as the entrepreneurs about, about policy. And again, I have asked the same questions because I've got a vested interest running this business here, but I also run those our accelerator labs in those countries. And the response is there is, today if I go to some of the big investment houses and say, come and look at our innovators in one of those locations, they are very willing to be there versus when I'm inviting them to come here. So there is a perception of both whether you call it policy clarity or policy welcome, right? That we sense there is a holdback, right? So in terms of the enterprise coming out of the society, there is plenty, right? That in terms of and then on top of that, right now, if you look at, of course, there's a demand challenge. There is a perception that the demand has disappeared, but that's a very small small point. But otherwise, in a broader sense, there is certainly that point about possibly of the perception of lack of welcome on policy.
Piyush, let's be specific. What is it in the policy regime that's holding back or discouraging or killing innovation? Look, let's, labor, land, logistics, all of those infrastructure constraints we understand. I mean, this and previous governments have tried to encourage and incentivize R&D and innovation in this country. And this relates, by the way, also to Gautam's presentation, that we want to triple the size of large number of companies, but that will happen only through the S-curve, right?
I was going to bring that up. So
tell me what is precisely missing for innovation and R&D?
Capital will look for support for return, because investing for the innovation to scale up, we will need capital.
No, but what about innovation itself? Why doesn't that happen?
It is happening. I'm saying every tech entrepreneur. Look at every possible tech entrepreneur that has risen in the world has an India connection or is an Indian. So that is there
in India as well right now.
Sorry,
not as if it is not happening in India, but it is not happening enough right now. I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. I want us to move on because there are 3-4 other areas to cover, and this is an important one. Let's park it for the moment, and if we get time, let's come back to this. Piyush, I want to ask you another one. There is this conundrum about a lot of liquidity sloshing around in the system, but banks either unwilling or unable to provide funding to industry, and banks being concerned about their own balance sheet, managers of banks being concerned about their own individual reputation if any loan goes bad in the future. How do you think this will pan out eventually once this crisis situation is over in 2 or 3 years' time? Do you think the banks will come out heroes or villains out of this?
God, you ask questions. If I had perfect answers for, I would be a much wiser man. But look, I think the banks have a very difficult challenge, right? And they're particularly difficult challenge if you're a public sector bank, right? Because your sense of social purpose, the burden of social purpose is much higher if you're a public sector bank. Your tenure is limited. Your ability to implement a long-term agenda is limited as well. So I do think that the government has debated the whole abolishment of fixed tenure, quite a bit. I do think they need to do that.
Let me interrupt here, Piyush. I was on the Narasimham committee many moons ago, okay? And this recommendation was made at that time. So to the question that Rajiv is asking, some decisions which need to be taken do get taken, but many decisions which need to be taken do not get taken. So we do.
And as he said, we are a complex society. It's hard to implement. So I agree with that. But that tenure is a bottleneck, right? You know that if you want to follow through on a big change, you need tenure as a chief exec or at the helm of a bank, right? So that's one aspect that I do think is an impediment. On the other hand, right now, I don't think a bank is unwilling to lend, right? The banks are willing to lend. I do think, they're very hesitant, and hesitant on two parts. One is, that there is lack of confidence, but that's a short-term thing. Hopefully that, a couple of quarters, that will be behind us. But there's lack of clarity of database decision making, so that they can prove that the decisions made was on the back of a very solid, objective analysis. So I do think of the, investment again on database decision making and shared data across the system, right? So, so that you have the ability to say, okay, if there's is one bank affected by a erroneous data submission by a corporation, then the other has got the same access, and therefore encouraging utilities, especially across public sector banking, because that still is 70% of our banking system, let's face it, right? 65 or thereabouts. So making sure that we can create some levels of data utilities, and as we are creating these champion banks, also giving some of them primary responsibilities on being the data owners of certain sectors to drive that, will help propagate a more confident lending, to your point about then giving the confidence among the individual managers to not hesitate about making decisions. So look, to try to be brief, I would stop there. And if you want me to elaborate, obviously I can go on talking about banking till cows come home.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this report that Rajiv just referred to, which McKinsey has just turned out, about the need to triple the large corporations in India and the missing middle on the mid-size enterprises, and the ability or the need to create 90 million new jobs? Just in a short version of that, if you can just give us, and what do you think can be done to make that work now? Again, I'm going back to Rajiv's question. What should be done now?
Yeah, no, we had a discussion. 2-3 thoughts maybe I just reinforce. One is, I think we all are concerned about the jobless growth of the last era, and I think simple demographics of India requires us to create about 90 million jobs in the non-farm sector over the next decade, right? Just simply to be able to create jobs for people who are coming into the working population. So I go back to the fact that productivity growth becomes critical, because GDP growth rate is essentially labor increase and productivity growth. You see, on the large firms point, Sunil, we benchmarked about 18 countries around the world that have delivered high levels of per capita growth rate over 20 to 50 years. Obviously, a lot goes into it, right? But many of them were export-driven economies. Many of them also had high levels of private investment and so on. But one thing we saw was the emergence of large number of competitive world-class firms in these markets, right? So when we did this work for the purpose, we said any large firm more than $500 million today in India represents about half of India's GDP. Same thing you compare to Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan, you find that it's about 75-80% of their GDP. So if you project the thing forward, right, and if you assume some meaningful growth rate over the next decade, our sense is that India does need many more large competitive firms. Part of the reason that's important is because they create an ecosystem. When a Maruti Suzuki develops, through it you develop another 100 auto ancillaries, and through that second and third tier providers of capital and labor get created. Now, the issue is when you look at the Indian corporate ladder, you find that even at the next tier, companies between 50 million to 500 million, we have less than half of the number of companies we need even for our current GDP. Right? So when you project the whole movie forward for the next decade, we postulate that you ideally need about 10,000 small companies to become medium size, and you need about 1,000 of those medium sized companies to move up to become large companies. So that's a little bit of the climbing the ladder, as we call it. It has to start at the bottom with much more mass entrepreneurship, but then you have to allow them to scale. And that's not been happening much over the last couple of years. You find that this mobility is actually almost stopped. Part of the reason, I would say twofold. One is what I think Piyush was talking about, capital. You see, you need risk capital. We all know entrepreneurs need risk capital, and I think that has been hard to access for the small to medium-sized companies. Right? It's very skewed. In fact, we looked at it, 70% all the equity capital that has been raised in this country has been done by 0.7% of the companies. 70% of the entire equity issuance in this country has been done by 0.7% of the companies. Risk capital is not easy to access for a lot of the small and medium companies. And the second big issue is the high ease of doing business, or call it the high cost of doing business, which is damn hard for small and medium scale companies to navigate. So we think those are the kinds of issues that have to be addressed. And the last thing I would say on the capital side, by the way, the issue is not just access to capital, it's also cost of capital. We benchmarked, we found there's a 5 percentage point difference between cost of credit in India and other markets. Part of the reason, by the way, Sunil, it's the case is because of, again, 1/3 of the reason is inefficiency of the banking system. And therefore, as the banks get restructured and hopefully some of them get privatized, we hope that part of the inefficiency can be taken out. But those are some thoughts on the large firms. On the agenda, there's a lot. I think there's a lot that needs to get done. I think our sense is we've identified actually a whole handful of areas, high productivity jobs, because it's not about just the old jobs, high productivity jobs. And the only thing I leave behind is now is the moment to take some major reform, right? Government has announced that some of the measures in power and agriculture, but I think there are many other areas, particularly I would say financial sector reform, in addition to real sector reform that should be pursued right now.
Let me ask Rajiv of one of these before Rajiv asks the question. Rajiv, land resources, as you know, since you spoke of factors of production, land has been one of the issues in India. On a power purchase parity, we have one of the highest land prices in India, in the world. And it's hard to justify when you look at the size and the type of economy and the type of industry that we have in the country. What do you think is a real possibility? And we've all discussed this, of using large tracts of land which are currently owned by government and lying idle. Government or public sector enterprises and the like, the railways own it. There are many other institutions which own land, which has been idle for decades on end. What is the possibility of converting that into easy, accessible, transparently priced use for industry and for housing, industry including housing, social housing as well?
You're making life very difficult by adding all those adjectives, transparent, plain, or whatever. And nonetheless, let me give you
because if you don't do that, Rajiv, it doesn't work. That's the only way to actually make it work, to bring the price down.
Let me give you a 3-part answer.
Yeah.
And some very good news there.
Yeah.
The first part answer is that the GPIIT, and I had a presentation by them very recently by the secretary himself, that they are now preparing a what is it called, a GIS link, a sort of map of India,
yes,
which will give you all the land holdings of the government and its entities and agencies, including the state governments, in a digitized manner, so that you will see it all there, and you would know as to which land is available, and they're trying to also emulate what Telangana has done, which is not only to just identify the land, but also put it there on the map as to what industry can come where, because they've got zones that they want really just to be populated by particular industries, etc. And this will be rolled out. I think they're just waiting for some little bit, because they've done it for 19 states already, and they're going to try and roll it out very soon, so that the industry knows that these are land which are already in government ownership, and therefore no land clearance, etc. is required, and they can negotiate a price with the government, for that particular project. So there's millions of hectares there. So so the whole land issue will be, and by the way, does not still include defense lands.
Correct.
So they're again in plenty. So
yes,
which
is the largest landowner.
But also it's, we can come to that later on. So that's the first part. The second good news there, therefore, is that that NITI Aayog is in charge of and is pushing asset monetization to the government, which includes not just land but also other assets. And we've tried to do this with the railways now, and so therefore you've got all these railway stations being, going into public-private partnership. You've got the airport going into public-private partnership, etc. And we're trying to develop a model for easy monetization, hopefully also transparent, of asset holdings of the government, which can include land plus buildings. So that's the second. And the third thing, which we are trying, and NITI Aayog has been trying to push very hard, is to improve the FSI. Because I think in our country we've got some amazingly low FSI levels. I mean, Vienna has 20, Singapore has 70. We still exist at the highest level of 4:1. And Mumbai is all things.
There are more places at 1.2 rather than at 4.
Yeah, well, there are only 3 cities at 4.
Yeah.
The rest of us are between 1.2 to 1.5 or 1.7. So
Correct.
if you make that easier, then you can land gets available much bigger upwards. So those are the three good news that I wanted to give you. But the one that remains to be done, and which has to be done, is the whole process of the change in land use has to become much more transparent.
Yes.
And because wherever there is, I mean, you don't need to. So that's one, and the second one, of course, is related to the environment. So that when land is related to ecology and environment, so you don't want. So very short point that you don't want to permit units which meet individual criteria for emissions, because in some conglomerations the overall impact can be much bigger and they can create hotspots. So those are a few things, but I thought the three initiatives that the government is now taking should solve the land question in the days to come.
One comment, Sunil, if I could make on that. I think this is, Rajiv, very heartening to hear, by the way, because as you know, the other issue is the land high prices are also coming in the way of really the real estate and the housing market taking off, right, as one of the big determinants. And we all know that from a job creation standpoint, construction has one of the highest job multipliers of any sector in the world.
Correct.
So I think I'm glad if this were to happen, that would be material input. By the way, Turkey, I would also suggest looking at Turkey as a model between 2003 and 2013. Turkey did a great job in actually monetizing a lot of unutilized land parcels, specifically addressing it towards affordable housing. Almost 30,000 hectares was given and developed. I think it's a good case study of what can be done.
But again, please do remember that this will have to be a federal issue.
Yes.
Delhi can't do it alone.
Sure.
We have to bring the states on board.
I was actually going to suggest, Rajiv, if you and I were both part of these conversations, and I'm going back now many years ago, I'm talking now in the early 2000s when we had these conversations, that instead of trying to roll out something like this across the country, it would be a good idea to pick 3, 4, 5 places, experiment, roll it out there, test it, try it, modify whatever needs to be modified before it's rolled out across the country. I think we have the ability now to try. We have enough data gathering resources. You yourself, sitting in NITI Aayog, you guys have done a tremendous job on digitizing so many things. States are doing such a wonderful job in many areas. So I think we need to take advantage of this new age of accepting technology and digitization as the real tool. So I'm going to ask you, there are many questions coming in, by the way, from the audience. I'm just going to throw out 1 or 2 of them because I see we are running out of time now. There's a question from Saurabh Ghosh asking about, what do you think of the gig economy or medium of transaction using crypto coins or tokens? How much do you think India is possibly going to adapt this? And will the government play a role in this? This is for all 3 of you, anyone who chooses to answer this.
Look, I mean, today, crypto is there. It is a mechanism, that is now proven available. But we have to be careful. It is not for the uneducated, right? It will get a massive boost tomorrow when some of the sovereigns will start to offer crypto especially as an investment tool. The Chinese have made some strides in that.
The UK close to it now, as you know. Yeah.
So I do think, that will become increasingly. I do see a time in the future where you will have both crypto, non-crypto currency mechanisms working in economies, right? And that offer being available for investors. It will start at the HNI end of the market and then slowly move down, right? Where I do think it will get a massive boost is once we start to use blockchain for supply chain. When that happens, then you can start to do a closed loop cryptocurrency loop along with a digitized supply chain, and that will happen as well. So I'll pause there, let others comment.
Yeah, so I have to pass on that.
Okay, fine. So Gautam, let's talk a little bit about jobs. You talked about jobs. So one of our big concerns in India has been to try and strike this balance between more automation, more robotics, more equipment, and on the other hand is the need to create jobs. actually we have been presented by almost a heaven-sent opportunity now because of the migration which took place. When lots of people went back home, now some of them have come back and some will come back, but all of them will not come back. Do you think it's an opportunity here for us to on the one hand, create a more dynamic rural economy using these people who have some skills, have gone back, and where there appears to be a shortage now in the urban industrial clusters, could we now consider much more automation, robotics, machine learning, AI to boost both ends of this economy to create both jobs and higher productivity and higher efficiency all at the same time? Right. Is that a real practical expectation for India?
I think so, Sunil. I think that is the direction where we have to go. I think there is no doubt that automation, robotic process automation of processes, machine learning, these are things here to stay. I think some of our work suggests that almost 50% of the work globally will get impacted to some extent. In fact, we've even argued that 30% of the job content of 60% of all jobs will actually get automated in some shape or form. So that is a reality. I think it will hit different sectors at different times because the capital labor trade-offs in India are different from what we have seen elsewhere in the US and so forth, but it will happen to different degree in many places. Right. I think it will cause dislocation for sure. I think, but there is this conundrum. I think a lot of people have been raising this very good debate on whether all this productivity improvement will in fact destroy jobs, right? And I think at least one thesis which we believe is that over time the productivity enabling technologies should, maybe with a time lag, actually promote job creation. You see, if you go back into the history, we saw this even in China. If you look at 1990 to 2010, Rajiv, we were discussing it last week, manufacturing GDP grew at 16%, 14% was productivity growth, right? And you saw what happened in terms of job creation in China in that period of time in manufacturing. We saw the same in US retail. Employment grew at 2 to 3% while productivity grew at 4-5%. So Sunil, yes, these productivity enhancing technologies should, perhaps after some displacement, should help in creating higher quality jobs. I think there is going to be a near-term, as you call it, skilling agenda. I think there is going to be need to connect the demand for jobs and skills. I think this marketplace idea of how do we connect, I think that will need to address.
Be an opportunity. Piyush, you have been writing about this specific subject. Would you share your views with us?
My views on this, that I do think there is a big opportunity in terms of this crisis of rural migration or urban to rural migration. Because as I said to you earlier, I think this opportunity is existing in three parts. Number one, you've got a number of these urban migrants who've gone back to rural India who have experienced technology in a way that nowhere rural India had experienced. Whether it is, your Amazon, your Uber, all of that, right? Secondly, they have experienced organized financial services sector. The rural still does not have a yearning for organized. They have experience. They have gone back with debit cards. They've gone back with bank accounts, right? Then that's number two. Number three, they have seen people rise in entrepreneurship. So they've got an entrepreneurial bug because, there's a Mumbai taxi driver who came in, who was just driving, then bought an Uber, has seen somebody else go into 3 cars. So they've got an entrepreneurial bug. I do think that, if we can go in there and help them with structural financial, MSME financing and tap in that with their own innovation, to Rajiv, your point, can we tap in local innovation? Yes, we absolutely should. Then there is an opportunity to massively boost, rural growth in my view. Secondly, I also, which is a more structural point, I do say, I've said this before, so I'm repeating myself, that there is a question of a sunk investment that we'll have to make in some time in the future about decongesting some of our, very high urban clusters. And therefore, can we use that capital to maybe subsidize some of that MSME and lending right now, for this rural migration and innovate the supply chain? Because, as better than anybody else, the supply chain is massively disrupted. So you combine technology, structured financing, some subsidy and entrepreneurship, to create, possibly a massive booster to our growth in rural.
So as we wind this up, Rajiv, let me ask you a question. We have anywhere between 1 lakh to 3.5 lakh visitors on these sessions would come on live. I don't know what the number today is, but it normally is somewhere in that number. So it's a very large number of people who visit these Mind Monday sessions. So can we leave them with some sense of hope that this situation that we are being, and I'm talking only the negative part, because some industries have begun to improve. Bicycles, two-wheelers, tractors, sugar, fertilizer has already begun to improve. But there are some who are suffering badly, transportation, tourism, entertainment, and I'm not talking digital entertainment, but physical entertainment, etc. Many of them are suffering right now, and many connected industries are suffering because of some things being shut. Schools are closed, so the school buses are obviously not functioning either. Now, what hope and what expectation can we leave the audience with, that in coming weeks, coming months, we can hope to see a significant turnaround on those? We can hope to see a resolution between the states and the center of things like the GST, etc., to get the economy back on the rails of the individual states and, of course, the collective country.
Yeah. Sunil, I want to assure everybody who is tuned in that as far as the government in Delhi is concerned, there is not a day where we don't try and use this opportunity, try and use this crisis into taking some reform or the other forward. There is something or the other going on a daily basis, and I think a very good thing that NITI Aayog can do, and you can all do together, is to tot up all the measures that have been taken since the beginning of the lockdown period in about around May, not March, because March and April were to sort of involved. And you will see that there's a whole cumulative list of measures that is being taken, which will take effect as soon as conditions begin to normalize with respect to the pandemic itself. Now, I think this is where the biggest uncertainty at the moment is being caused by the pandemic and the course of the pandemic, as to we don't know as to where this is going, and how far will it spread. But nonetheless, I think the one biggest hope is that I suppose everybody has now recognized that the way to deal with the pandemic is to go hyper-local, and to contain it wherever it exists in a manner that we can contain it and let economic activity start in the manner that that it can start and carry on. So, which is why we're beginning to see some of the industries coming along. Now, I must put my neck out and say, and I don't want to go into the reasons for it. I heard somebody say it as well. At least I am personally not, and this is purely spoken as a person, not in favor of distributing helicopter money, because I know as an economist that money has pretty much zero multiplier effect. It's just a one-round increase in demand, and that just peters off very, very quickly. So what we are trying to do, and what I think will happen, is to create a much bigger push on the infrastructure side, which is also productivity enhancing. And I can maybe give you just sort of one example where you can do this very quickly, which was done, for example, in Gujarat. Let's start building much better housing for our police personnel and much better buildings for our district and lower courts, which are overcrowded, and where, all sorts of things, where they will have an immediate impact on improving productivity. Or, for example, judicial decisions on contract enforcement, etc., etc. So we need to identify those areas and then go out in a very big sort of concerted manner in a mission mode to do that. And this is housing, I think, as Gautam mentioned, and it's so on. I think that will have a much more sustained and much bigger impact. And these are the programs that we're trying to do. Now, the fact is that our agriculture, that's the biggest hope at the moment, was recognized as an essential service and was left, to be free, and therefore you got a very good Kharif option coming along. And there again, the government is taking steps to make agro-processing much more value-added and much more growing rapidly than in the past. So I think these are some of the areas where I would hold out the hope. And last one is on our human resources. I think the new education policy that has just been announced, I think everybody would agree is something which after 40 years, 37 years, is something of a, for our human resource intensive economy will create a new pathway forward. And the last one, and which is where I appeal to all of you, is that, the McKinsey report talks about increasing formalization of the economy and the need to do that. But for that, the basic bedrock is, for example, to try and improve our nutrition. About 38% of our kids being undernourished and 50% of our women being anemic. It doesn't make for a sort of equal formalized economy, and that's where the government and the NITI Aayog is focused like a laser. That we will try to do this in the last 4 years. We have already reduced this from 38 to 34%. As soon as the results of the National Health Survey 5 comes out, we will be again cracking on it, and you will see several initiatives here from the government to try and get that level of human capital above. Because without that, and which I find that very strange, that in most of our conversations, even in mine, excuse me, with due respect, we don't focus on those things. So that's the bedrock of human capital. And we must figure out as to how to improve that particular thing. Let me end.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajiv. Appreciate this. Thank you, all three of you. And by the way, just for your information, we have actually run a full session only on each of those sessions, including having the Minister for Education with us. The day he released the policy, the next day he was with us on this very session. So we have actually focused on each one of these. We've had the Minister for Highways talk about the infrastructure. We've had the Minister for Railways come and talk to us about railways. And we are not only looking at the ministers, we're also talking to politicians of different parties. Because one of the things we are hoping is to get some broad alignment in India on issues that matter to India and India's economy and to Indians in government and in the oppositions, to be supportive of big issues, which is the way every other democracy is able to continuously move forward. And to answer the question that both Piyush and Gautam raised, that how do you create policy certainty for people coming from outside, is the knowledge that the government and the opposition are concerned, aligned, and will support some initiative if it comes in, and we will not have jerky movements back and forth. And just on the last point, Rajiv, I completely agree with you. This is a wonderful time for big reforms, and reforms are taking place. But I have a slight difference with you, only on the one point of helicopter money. I don't think anybody is recommending irresponsible spending of money. But if you see where the demand has turned around, please watch it. It is only in these areas where the first big support of the government actually was provided. And I'm talking of both, so the fiscal and monetary, both have had an impact, but the monies that went into the rural economy, into agriculture, so anything connected to those are the ones where demand has actually picked up. Bicycles, motorcycles, scooters, tractors, sugar industry, fertilizer industry, you can actually go down the list. Plus, technology for communication, etc. So I think there is another dose at this moment which the industry and the consumer require, and it can be done thoughtfully, it can be done meaningfully, it can be done very carefully, but I think it does require to be done to ensure that we keep this push for consumption going, to allow industry to up its capacity utilization, then to attract additional investment, and to kickstart the virtuous growth cycle, because that at this moment is something that is necessary. And that is really the best answer for us, not any kind of subsidies, etc. That would provide the right fuel for the engine that we are all talking about. So thank you very much. And I believe we have a short film. We have also run a little bit over time. If we have time, we'll just show you a short film on a book that I actually just wrote on how the Hero as a corporation got set up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful conversation.
From the bylanes of Kamalia and the rugged landscapes of Quetta, they escaped to India with little more than the shirts on their backs. In the partition-ravaged cities of Amritsar, Agra and Delhi, 4 of the 6 Munjal brothers, Dayanand, Satyanand, Brij Mohanlal and Om Prakash, built their business part by part. Armed with nothing but self-belief, the brothers began with trading and then manufacturing bicycle parts, which soon evolved into the production of bicycles. For post-independence India, the hero bicycle gave wings to the aspirations of the common man. By 1986, 30 years after its inception, Hero Cycles became the largest bicycle maker in the world. In the next 15 years, the motorcycle venture, Hero Honda, repeated the feat. And both pole positions are held firmly even today. Hero's story is about humble beginnings, the refugee entrepreneurial spirit, hard work and zeal. It looks at how 4 brothers with little formal education created a world-class enterprise. This is the incredible tale of a principle-driven organization that created exceptional value for a society that desperately needed transportation. How did 4 brothers with distinct personalities work like a cohesive unit and build a manufacturing behemoth? How did they synchronize their strengths? How did they resolve their differences, if any? The story goes deep inside the family spirit, the parivar, that brought together employees, customers, channel partners, suppliers and local communities to create success, welfare and well-being for millions. This is the making of Hero. 4 brothers, 2 wheels, and a revolution that shaped India.
For this wonderful conversation. Next week, we will be back next Monday and have a more detailed conversation again on the economy this time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
There were many, many more questions I had for all of you, but this was a wonderful conversation which kind of flowed by itself. So allowed us to cover some things, but still left some questions open. So hopefully we'll get another occasion to figure out some of those answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Rajiv.
Bye to all. Thank you.